John, thank you very much. You had me worried there at the beginning. I thought you were going to tell us that it was too difficult and we shouldn't be doing impact assessment of policy research. A position, I might say, that I successfully defended during my 23 years at IFPRI. But times have changed. There was a time when donors just used to give us money at IFPRI. And then there came a time when they wanted research proposals before they gave us money. We thought it was very unreasonable, but we adapted. And now the same donors are saying, well, we not only want a research proposal, but we want a study at the end showing that you did what you said you were going to do and delivered some impact. Very unreasonable, but you're going to have to live with it. But there are other good reasons for doing impact assessment, and there was a period in the 90s where IFPRI was doing it this is a legitimate area of research. How does economic policy research impact on policy? What's the payoff to economic research? Phil Pardee even wrote a book about what is economics worth. That line of inquiry has gotten lost at IFPRI. It would be wonderful if we could resurrect that as a byproduct of having to do what the donors want. I got to get my pronouns right. I'm retired now. What the donors want you to do it, not me, not we. Okay. Those were fantastic presentations. Unfortunately, we only have about half an hour left, and I do want to give the Director General a few minutes at the end, I think, to tell us what all this means for IFPRI, how you're going to take this forward. We've got to convert, we don't want to, there are a lot of exciting arguments we can have about the complexities of doing impact assessment, the reasons for doing it, all those things. At the end of the day, IFPRI's got to have some practical procedures for actually getting on with doing this and building impact assessment frameworks into its future lines of research. So we really need to get down to the nitty-gritty at some point about what are the useful tools and approaches and what's it all going to cost, and is it reasonable even to expect that IFPRI researchers can do all this kind of stuff, or do you need specialized people to come in and do it for you? Anyway, let me open up the floor and take a bunch of questions, and then we do want to come back to our three panelists and get some more feedback from them. So, floor is open. Yeah, we do have many people here who are not IFPRI, and we have many people out there in hyperspace, whatever it is. So please introduce yourselves, and somewhere we have microphones. Vicky, we have a speaker down here at the front row.
Very much. I'm Marie Garder from the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, and I've been granted, I believe, 5 minutes to talk a little bit about 3IE's thinking on policy influence. So basically, as some of you may know, evidence-based policymaking is actually 3IE's ultimate objective. And I believe there's some ODI report that is mentioning that the average time it takes for policy influence is about 17 years. So in terms of measuring the success of 3IE, I think this, there's some discussion about this being setting us up for failure, because I don't think Gates and our other donors are going to be willing to wait that long. Now, let me talk just briefly about how we plan to go about coming up with good evidence that is going to lead into better policies. We do basically a couple of things. We finance primary research with proven policy interest and policy relevance. And we encourage causal chain analysis using mixed methods and cost-benefit analysis, cost-effectiveness, etc. So the idea is to finance research that not only shows whether something works, but why and for how much. We also finance systematic reviews of existing evidence around policy-relevant questions. And the idea there is to provide the state of evidence around these issues beyond one specific context where the evidence exists. But this provides the policy-relevant evidence, but how do we go from there to actually updating attitudes, leading to actions, leading to policy influence, and finally improving people's lives? And I think a lot of there were some very interesting cautionary tales and lots of very similar thinking that was presented by the panel. Very interesting. We work basically on 5 different lines of activities. First of all 3 IE studies are required to develop and implement what we call policy influence plans. These are plans where the grantees need to state what the policy influence objectives are from the outset, so think about it from the outset. They need to identify the key policy stakeholders that will help them in reaching those policy influencing objectives, and the actions that they will take in order to work with these stakeholders, and how this is going to be measured. We also do communication for policy influence clinics for grantees. This has been developed with ODI and is around the issues that have been spoken about around how to make policy briefs, how to talk to the media, how to identify the main stakeholders, etc. We also have a research program and experiments on how to maximize uptake of evidence, very much along the lines of what John mentioned. This is currently we were mainly working with the IDS on this, but hoping we can collaborate also with IFPRI on this. Fourth, we're also doing case studies on existing impact evaluations and retrospectively trying to look at how and whether these studies influence policy. So this is how we're hoping to work with policy influence. Now, how will we assess whether the policy influence...
Sorry, I mean,
Yes.
are you coming to a question? Or, I mean, I want to open the floor up to others, but, I mean, we're noting that 3IE is an institute that could provide support to teams. Did I hear you even say you have money to help pay for impact assessment?
That is correct.
Okay.
That is some of the things, some of the issues we do.
But I'm going to have to stop you here. I'm
Okay.
sorry. But 3IE, your website is?
www.impactevaluation.3ie.org.
Okay, and you'll be around after to continue. All right, I'm sorry, we're going to have to move on. Anyone else? Derek Biley.
Derek Biley, I'm the chair of the Standing Panel on Impact Assessment of the CGIAR. And let me say that we particularly welcome this initiative and IFPRI's rediscovery of impact assessment. And as you said, Peter, it's an area that's been very much under-evaluated in the past. And I think there's some really good stories out there to tell. I very much enjoyed the three presentations today. I think what this shows that we're making real progress in this area. The SPIA, the Standing Panel, undertook a series of these studies about 3 years ago, which are published in the November issue last year of World Development. IFPRI was part of that. It was very much learning on the job. I think we've got what we've seen as a whole set of tools and approaches that can enhance our ability to do this in the future. I just noticed, though, that the smallholder dairy was part of the ODI study. It was also part of the CGIAR IFPRI study. So it indicates, I think, that there's lots of actors out there, and we're all claiming the credit for changing the policies. So, my question for IFPRI is, in terms of how you're going to select your cases to do this. I think what we've heard, this is an expensive, relatively expensive activity. You can only evaluate a relatively small part of your total research portfolio. So, there's different ways you can think about it. You can do some sort of random sampling like ACIR does in Australia. You can do what you think are the easy ones to do methodologically. You can go for the ones where you think you've got the really big payoffs, because if you get a few big payoffs, they pay for all of IFPRI's research and probably all of CGIAR's research. So I think that's a really big question for you as you move ahead here is how you're going to select the case studies.
Okay. More questions, contributions? Agnes, yes.
I'm Agnes Kisselbing from IFPRI. I'm often virtual, so I'm introducing myself. I actually wanted to pick up on some points raised by all the speakers. One was that I think the first speaker spoke about the importance of communications and developing relationships. And oftentimes researchers are told that we need to communicate more effectively. We need to present our findings in ways that the layperson will understand, basically to come up with sexy sound bites. Now, I want to link it with what John said, John H., that we're not really in this for the money. So the question is it better to provide the right evidence or to perpetuate so-called convincing myths which sound wonderful and which people very easily believe? And I'm going to give you a concrete example, if I may. I'll try to be brief. There is this myth going around about the 60 to 80% contribution of women in agriculture. And there's been no statistical evidence for that myth. And recently, for the State of Food and Agriculture, recent empirical work has shown that there's really been no statistical basis for that. A lot of people were actually upset when the new figures came out, because they thought that a lot of their policy advocacy for gender in agriculture was being demolished. And so people were asking questions like, is research then bad for women? And I was like, oh, wow, but I never expected to hear a question like that. But it was an issue of, given that evidence can be manipulated and the reach of and the potential influence of such evidence can be quite powerful, what do we do about it? And it also relates to Derek's point about, are we loading the dice by choosing which projects are going to be evaluated, because some are going to give you quick wins and others will take you much longer time periods with which to evaluate impact.
Gentleman over here.
Hi, yes, thank you. My name is Nicolas Troncoso. I work at the World Bank. I just have a quick question. One of the speakers mentioned the importance of being purposive and adaptive when doing evidence-based, when trying to influence policy. And it seems that all the speakers mentioned how complex and how time-consuming it is, and you have to build relationships and do social networking analysis. I was just wondering, what do you do in times of crises? I mean, how do you prioritize as a researcher in times of crisis? I mean, right now, there's food riots in Africa, and the Vietnam example, where they had the export restrictions, I mean, that's where a lot of countries were panicking. They didn't have access to that market, or what happened with the Russian fires, or whether it's aquifers being depleted. What do you do as a researcher in times of crises where the geopolitics or the geopolitical sphere of world relationships is heavily influenced by a country's ability to produce food and feed itself and export? Thank you.
You guys okay if we take a few more? Couple more? Do we have any emails? No. One at the... So this one, and then Klaus at the back, and then we better go to the panel.
Hello, thank you. I'm Hezekiah Aguara, and I'm a doctoral candidate in public policy at the School of Public Policy, George Mason University. So I think IFPRI can talk to me if they want to figure out how to do policy analysis in the future. But I wanted to thank the panelists for bringing out the core issues and the different sets of aspects of the whole issue of evaluating policies. And I wanted to think from 3 different perspectives, given the audience in this room. As agricultural scientists, we can control our environments when we're doing our research. As economists, you can force your variables to come up with whatever equation or model you want to analyze. As a policy scientist, you don't have those kind of luxuries because you're dealing with a lot of ambiguous situations. So when you're trying to analyze policy influence or evaluate policy influence, then you have to think of what are you going to be measuring? And how are you going to be measuring those particular variables given the ambiguous nature of the whole process? And my fear for IFPRI is that what we've talked about here is more about thinking in the form of designing policies. We are talking more policy design, like you follow a linear kind of process you have in the adoption of technologies and all that. But then the downside with that is that in most cases, researchers don't like to own the policies they recommend. Because if something goes wrong, the policymakers are going to blame you. And most people do not want a situation whereby they're taking responsibilities for whatever mess the policymakers have made in the process of implementing the policies. So I don't know how IFPRI is going to go around that particular challenge and come up with a more credible process or convince the policymakers to actually follow what recommendations they're making. And the second point related to ambiguity is, in most cases, policy changes are episodic, or they're more like windows of opportunity where people could be doing research for a long time, then all of a sudden a window comes up where there's a way to intervene in the policy process. And I didn't hear this from the panelists. I didn't see it being incorporated in the framework. So maybe you can just respond on that. Thank you.
Thank you. And then Klaus at the back.
Yeah, I have a question which may sound critical, but is not meant critical. The policy process was described as erratic, non-linear. Basically, the one doesn't look like the other. Now, isn't one of the reasons to do these studies is to find certain norms and regularities? So what actually then do you learn if they are all different?
Okay. We really have to go back to the panel. Shall we take you in reverse order? John, I guess unfortunately, you all have to come up here in turn because there are other people. You can't be seen from where you sit.
Yeah, rather than taking all those questions individually, I'm just going to pick up on a couple of themes that are raised by a couple of the speakers. One of which is to say, when we talk about influencing policy and policy processes, which part, in some sense, does it matter most that you influence? And I think both in response to Agnes's question about gender issues, and I'm sorry, the gentleman from the World Bank, I didn't catch your name, you had a question about how do you respond in the context of crises. I think both of these point to the importance of trying to have influence at the level of agenda setting and of policy formulation. To take an example, in the context of crises or regarding rising food prices, is there's an issue in some sense, do you have influence on a particular policy a government follows? Or perhaps is it as important or more important to talk about what are have people aware of what are the distributional consequences of different policy actions that they might choose? And what I would argue is, of course, is in some sense, an ideal world, you would like some influence on both. But in the longer term, what I would argue is most important is your ability to get people to think more broadly about those distributional consequences. And so when those crises emerge, people are in some sense in a better position. They have more, going back to my earlier example, they've got greater capability to analyze and assess these issues. And I think that also then applies to Agnes's point, which is that arguably one of the most important parts of IFPRI's research on gender is not so much the implementation of specific gender policies, but more the whole area of actually getting people to think about gender in a broader context, where it is important to bring it into discourse in agriculture and other areas, and so on and so forth. And then finally, there's the last question about what is the role of research from a gentleman who's the doctoral student. And the notes I wrote to myself here just said, well, who owns the recommendations? And what I would argue is that, in fact, it should be the people who are responsible for those decisions and those who are affected by them who ultimately should own those recommendations. And the example I was thinking of is the following. Supposing I came up to you, and let's say you had a headache, okay? Your choice is the following, okay? I come up to you and say, you've got a headache? You know what? I've got this greatest thing you can do for headaches. Just take this little magic pill and your headache will go away. Or you could say, well, you know what? There have been careful, peer-reviewed, rigorous trials in all these different medicines. And based on this collection of evidence that we believe when you have your particular headache, this is the best medicine for you. Well, never take advice from me on how to deal with headaches. So leaving that aside, what I would argue is, in some sense, is that people, in some sense, if we want sustainable policy influence, we want that to come out through not of just one particular study, my example of my one person giving you advice, but actually a collection of studies, a collection of research, in some sense drilling down sort of all the work that goes around that collective effort. So in some sense that when you make the decision which medicine to take, you are in some sense, you are owning that decision based on a broad set of knowledge which is brought to you, and not just the one particular advice given by an IFPRI researcher or someone else. Okay.
Okay, I'm going to pick up on some of them. First of all, an apology to Derek and SPIA and ILRI. We were actually commissioned by ILRI to help them to do those studies. So, and I think I used the wrong cover of the report. We have a cover of the report with ILRI and SPIA on it and everything. But you also raised the issue about who's going to choose what cases to study. And I mean, my view would be that we should look at negative cases as well as positive cases, or cases where there doesn't seem to have been any influence on policy, as well as those where there has been. And what's quite interesting in the impact evaluation field is how the predominance of positive case studies which are in the public domain, and there are a very large number of case studies which somehow don't tell a positive story and never get into the public domain. And I think often there's more to learn from what didn't work than from what did work. And in that particular work we did with ILRI, we specifically tried to select cases in different countries, in Kenya, Tanzania and Ethiopia, in contexts where ILRI had had different forms of engagement: long-term single focus, long-term multiple focus, long-term no focus at all, and also ones which worked and which didn't work, to try and see whether there were characteristics which would help ILRI to decide how to do its research better, or to do its research in a way which would maximize the likelihood of it having an impact in future. George, I think, talked about windows of opportunity and why didn't we mention them. Well, as Fred said at the beginning of the talk, the organisers were very fierce in terms of the amount of time that we were given, and certainly in the longer version of my talk, that's a very important element of the initial stage of the process of deciding what to do, looking at the context, trying to understand the context. And in some contexts, I think Fred mentioned it actually, in some contexts policymakers are looking for solutions to problems, and in other contexts they're not. And I think a key thing, and certainly was the case in the work that I was doing in Indonesia on decentralization of public services, even at times when there is absolutely no hope of policy change. With Suharto in power in Indonesia, there was no way that decentralization was going to happen, despite the fact that it had been on the high-level policy agenda, what's called the Repelita, the 5-year plan. Repelita 6 talked about decentralization for 5 years. No way was it going to happen with Suharto in power, because that would have undermined the capacity of Jakarta-based bureaucrats to extract their rent on all development activity. But as soon as there was the economic crisis, the political crisis, the downfall of Suharto, there was this fantastic demand for decentralization of public services. And by pure fluke, the project which I was working on, which was funded by DFID, had been doing research on how services might be decentralized in the livestock sector. And we went from the position of banging our head against a brick wall and getting absolutely nowhere, and the story I told you at the end of my talk about the Director General of Livestock Services saved us once but wasn't going to save us again, to the door being flung open and us being asked, how do we do this? And we were saying, well, actually, we don't know quite yet how to do it. There's another interesting story about that. They accidentally decentralized air traffic control, but that's a different story. And Klaus at the back talked about, are we barking mad to be looking for norms in a process which we've been saying all along is non-linear, is complex, non-linear, and what's the third one? Complex, non-linear, and chaotic. I can't remember. We're not looking for norms in terms of specific things that should be done. We're looking at, as I was trying to explain, iterative processes so that you can decide what to do depending on a context and depending on a continual review of the context. So we're not saying that every project should do X in terms of produce a certain type of communication output or a certain type of engagement strategy with the stakeholders. What we're saying is that every project should decide what it is trying to achieve, develop some kind of a theory of change or a causal change pathway, and then figure out what it needs to do in order to set out on that path and continually review as it goes down that path. And if it discovers it's the wrong path, should come back and do something else. Thanks.
Thanks. I'll pick up on a couple. Go back on Derek's point on the multiple influences, because even though in that case it was the same study, there are lots of places where lots of people claim credit. And somebody came up with a great example this morning of the person who smashes the rock with the sledgehammer gets all the credit, but in fact it's all the hard work at hitting it before that created all the fractures that allowed somebody to finally break it. So there are always all of those multiple influences. So in terms of methodologies, I would look to history. I think history is actually something we ignore as an approach to the study of science that is actually quite important when we are studying processes over long periods of time where we don't have consistent programs, we keep changing our priorities, but in fact we're generally doing the same thing. So I think I would look to history. I think that's an important set of tools that we should be looking to. Agnes, I think you sort of counterpointed to things that weren't quite the same, of sound bites versus the truth, when in fact the idea is really that researchers give such long explanations often, rather than simply saying, what was the problem, what research did I do, and what did I find out? And really getting those messages out clearly and in plain language, I think, is a big challenge in the research community. On the what do we do in the crisis, Nicholas had to leave, I see, but I'll answer briefly anyway. Researchers don't have that much role once the crisis hits. If you haven't anticipated what the problem is going to be, if you haven't anticipated there's going to be a food crisis and done some research about that, once it's hits, forget it. The policymakers need answers and they need them now. So a big role of researchers is to anticipate, to think ahead, to plan. We saw that in a lot of case studies. Episodic, absolutely. Windows of opportunity. I think the whole idea of the decision context is a different way to describe windows of opportunity, that there's sometimes direct demand, sometimes there's partial openness, but there's lack of clarity on certain points, and it's understanding where the lack of clarity is that allows you to begin to manage some of your interventions. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.